Hello and welcome to the live read of Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nimh by Robert C. O'Brien. Today we'll be reading the next two chapters in the book, so let's get into it. Chapter 8. Go to the Rats. Mrs. Frisby began, nervously, trying to arrange her thoughts. It's about my youngest son, Timothy. He's sick, too sick to leave his bed, and moving day is only 5 days off. Wait, said the owl. Moving from where? And moving to where? From the garden patch, where we're living, to the edge of the pasture by the stream. Which garden? It had not occurred to Mrs. Frisby until now that a bird flying freely over miles of countryside would look down on so many gardens. Well, it belongs to Mr. Fitzgibbon. The one with the large stone. Yes, my house is near the stone. What makes you so sure moving day will come in 5 days? Mrs. Frisby told him about the tractor and what Mr. Fitzgibbon had said, 5 days until plowing. Of course, she added, it might turn cold again and freeze or even snow. No, said the owl, sounding quite sure. It will not. The wild onions are already up in the pastures. He asked her then what kind of house she had, and exactly where it was in relation to the big stone. Apparently he knew the spot well. But the more she talked to him, the more Mrs. Frisby became convinced that he would produce no solution to her problem. It had been foolish of her to think that he could, foolish of her to come at all, because she thought there really was no solution. At last she fell silent, and the owl asked no more questions. Finally he said, lying where it does, your house will inevitably be turned up by the plow, and probably broken to bits in the process. There is no feasible way to prevent this. My only advice to you is this. If you stay in the house, you will surely be crushed and killed, all of you. Therefore, it is better to take your chance with moving. Wrap your son, Timothy, up as warmly as you can. Help him as much as possible on the journey, and hope for warm weather on moving day. That way you're at least sure to save yourself and the other children. The owl paused, turned away from her, and looked again at the entrance to his hollow. The patch of light it admitted was growing steadily dimmer. And now, if you'll excuse me, the night is falling, and I have no more time to spare. I regret that I cannot give you a more satisfactory solution to your problem. Good evening, He paused. I don't believe you told me your name. Mrs. Frisby, the poor mouse spoke, with a sob in her throat, for the owl had said exactly what she feared he would say, and she had no real hope for Timothy. The owl had said, in effect, either Timothy alone must die, or them all must die together. Even if moving day should be extraordinarily warm, the nights were sure to be frosty, and that would be the end of him. Still, one must be polite, and she added, sadly, I thank you, sir, for listening to me. But at the mention of her name, an extraordinary change had come over the owl. He turned back to face her again and stared at her most intently. Indeed, he gave an agitated flutter of his wings, and half flew, half hopped closer to her, bending forward until his great sharp beak was only a few inches from her face. Mrs. Frisby shrank back in fear. What had she done wrong? Did you say Mrs. Frisby? Yes, you asked my name. Mrs. Jonathan Frisby? Yes, he was my husband. He died last summer. He was Timothy's father. But how did you know about him? That is not important, said the owl, drawing back a little and looking at her in a new way, almost as if with deference. I will say this. His name was not unknown in these woods, and if you are his widow, that put matters in a different light. Something in the way he said this caused Mrs. Frisby's hope to lift a little. What do you mean? She asked. I mean, madam, that there is a way that your son's life might just possibly be saved. I did not mention it to you because I saw no way you could conceivably do it, and I did not want to arouse false hope. But if you are Jonathan Frisby's widow, then perhaps it can be done. I don't understand at all, said Mrs. Frisby. What is this thing? It's not a thing that I can do myself. You must go to the rats. To the rats? But I don't know any rats. They have nothing to do with me. I don't doubt that. They have little to do with anyone except themselves, and will have less as time goes on, but nonetheless, I think they will help you. And if they will, they can. But what can they do? They must move your house to a place where it will be safe from the plow. Now Mrs. Frisby's spirits fell again, and she said, almost bitterly, Oh, you're joking, sir. You are not serious. No rat could move my house. It is far too heavy and much too big. The rats on Mr. Fitzgibbon's farm have things. They have ways you know nothing about. They are not like the rest of us. They are not, I think, even like most other rats. They work at night, in secret. Mrs. Frisby, do you know their main entrance? In the Rosebush? Yes. Go there. You will find a sentry guarding the door. His name is Justin. Tell him who you are, and that you come at my request. Tell him that you want to see a rat named Nicodemus. I think they will let you in, though they may insist on swearing you to secrecy. If they should ask that, you must, of course, use your own judgment, but my advice would be to do as they ask. Mrs. Frisby was close to complete bewilderment. Secrecy, she said. Secrecy about what? That I cannot reveal. I, too, have agreed to it. Also, there is much I do not know, though I have given advice on certain aspects of their projects. Well, said Mrs. Frisby, I don't understand at all, but if it might save Timothy, I will try to do what you say. Tell them, added the owl, that I suggest moving the house into the lee of the stone. Remember that, the lee of the stone. And do not forget the names, Justin and Nicodemus. Justin, Nicodemus, the lee of the stone, repeated Mrs. Frisby. I will remember. She was now so entirely puzzled that she did not think to ask what the phrase meant. Presumably, the rats would know. And Mrs. Frisby, said the owl, moving again toward the entrance to the hollow, please understand. I was an admirer of your late husband, though I never met him in person. I wish you well. I hope your son's life can be saved. You see, I can understand your particular need, for I face a similar problem. You? Said Mrs. Frisby. But you have no moving day. I have lived in this tree, in this same hollow, the owl said, for more years than anyone can remember. But now, when the wind blows hard in winter and rocks the forest, I sit here in the dark, and from the deep down in the hole, down near the roots, I hear a new sound. It is the sound of strands of wood creaking in the cold and snapping one by one. The limbs are falling. The tree is old. It's dying. Yet I cannot bring myself, after so many years, to leave. to find a new home and move into it, perhaps to fight for it. I, too, have grown old. One of these days, one of these years, the tree will fall, and when it does, if I'm still alive, I will fall with it. With this sad prediction, the owl stepped through his doorway, spread his great wings, and was gone, soaring silently downward into the shadowy woods below. Mrs. Frisby followed him out onto the limb, and to her relief, Jeremy was still waiting where she had left him, though not very patiently. "We must hurry," he said. "It's almost dark. I'm not supposed to be out so late." Mrs. Frisby, who had the same feeling, climbed on his back, much less afraid now, for two reasons. First, she was getting used to air travel, and second, since the woods below them were dark, she could no longer see how far away the ground was. "He talked to you for a long time," said Jeremy as they flew. "Did he tell you anything that will help?" "I don't know," said Mrs. Frisby. Since the owl had brought up the matter of secrecy, and had in fact been secretive himself, she was not sure just how much she could tell Jeremy. "Well, why don't you know? I mean, he told me some things, but I don't know whether they'll help or not." She decided to counter with a question of her own. "What does 'in the lee' mean?" Jeremy, being like all birds, knowledgeable about the wind, knew the answer to that. It means the calm side, the side that wind doesn't blow from. When there's a strong wind, you fly up to the barn from the lee, so you don't get bashed into the wall. My father taught me that. "I see," said Mrs. Frisby, and she became more puzzled than ever. What had the wind to do with it? "He told me," she said, finally, deciding it could do no harm, "to go and see the rats." "The rats?" Jeremy was startled. "But they don't have anything to do with us." "I know, but he thought they might help." "What could they do?" "He thought they might move my whole house, but how they could do it I can't imagine." "Oh, I don't doubt that they could," said Jeremy. "Everyone knows, at least all the birds know, that the rats can do things. They're up to something. Nobody's quite sure what. For one thing, they're building themselves a new house, way back in the woods, over the mountains. They've even made quite a big clearing near it. I'd show you, but it's too dark now. They used to carry food like the rest of us, but now we see them with other things. Pieces of metal and bits of machinery and things I can't even recognize. They take them into that rose bush, and what happens to them I don't know, but the owl knows more than most. I expect he's had some dealings with them. Just the same, I've never heard of their helping anybody but themselves." "Neither have I, but I'm going to ask them anyway, and there isn't anyone else to ask." By the time they reached the garden, it had gone almost completely dark, and Jeremy could not linger. "Good night, Jeremy," said Mrs. Frisby, feeling most affectionate towards the crow. "Thank you for taking me, and for waiting to bring me back." "You're welcome," said Jeremy. "If you need me again, just ask. After all, if it weren't for you, I wouldn't be here to ask." And he flew off into the darkness, the last crow to get home that night. Chapter 9. In the Rosebush. When Mrs. Frisby got home, Teresa, Martin, and Cynthia were eating supper, as she had told them to do if it got dark before she returned. Coming silently down the tunnel, she could hear them talking in the room below, and she paused a moment to eavesdrop on their conversation. Obviously, Cynthia had been worrying, and Teresa was reassuring her. "She couldn't have gone back sooner than this, Cindy, don't you remember? The crow said it was a mile to the tree. It might even be farther." "Yes, but crows fly so fast." "But if he went 2 miles high," that was Martin, "it would be 3 miles altogether." "6, said Teresa. 2 up, 2 down, and 1 to get there and 1 to get back." "Oh, that's right. No wonder she isn't back yet." "Well, but what about the owl? You don't know how owls are." "It was still light when they got there. He couldn't see." "But it's dark now," said Cynthia. "Oh, I wish she'd come back. I'm scared." Not so loud, Teresa said. Timothy will hear. I'm home, called Mrs. Frisby, hurrying the rest of the way down. And now it appeared that they had all been worried, for they ran to her. Even Martin, who ordinarily avoided such displays, threw his arms around her. Oh, Mother, cried Cynthia near tears. I was so worried. Poor Cynthia, it's all right. How high did you fly? Asked Martin, recovering quickly. High enough so the trees looked like bushes, the garden like a postcard, and the river like a snake. Did you see the owl? What did he say? I saw him. Later, I'll tell you about it, but first I want to see Timothy. How is he? Why didn't you move his bed out here? Teresa said, I wanted to, but he said he'd rather stay in the bedroom. I think he's feeling worse again. But when Mrs. Frisby went to see him, she found him sitting up, and his forehead felt not at all feverish. I'm all right, he said. I stayed in here because I wanted to think about something. Thinking about what? About moving day. Moving day? But why? What about it? Had he, after all, overheard her talking to the others? Heard about her flight to the owl? But no, he was explaining. I haven't been outside since I got sick, so I don't know what it's like. I mean, the weather. But today, this afternoon, I noticed something. What was that? A smell in the air. A warm, wet smell. If you sniff, you can still smell it, though it's not so strong now. Mrs. Frisby had noticed this, of course, both indoors and out. It's the smell of the frost melting, Timothy went on. I remember it from last year, and after that it wasn't long until we moved. Mother, when are we going to move this year? Oh, not for a long time yet, Mrs. Frisby tried to sound as casual as she could. It's still much too cold. Too early to think about it. I have to think about it, said Timothy. He sounded serious, but calm and unworried. Because if it comes too soon, I don't know if I can go. I tried walking a little bit today in here when the others were outside. Timothy, you're supposed to stay in bed. You'll make yourself sick again. I know, but I had to find out. And I didn't walk much. I couldn't. I only went a few steps. And I got so dizzy, I had to lie down again. Of course you did. You haven't really recovered yet. I guess I haven't. That's why I wanted to think. Timothy, you must not worry about it. That will only make you worse. I'm not worried at all. I thought I would be, but I'm not. Or maybe I think I should be, but I can't. What I really think about is how nice it is there in the summer beside the brook. And it's true, I want to go. But I'm not scared. I was afraid you might be, or that you might think I was. That's really what I want to tell you. I'm just going to wait and see what happens. So you shouldn't worry about it either. Mrs. Frisby realized that he had somehow switched their positions. He had seen the danger he was in, guessed somehow that moving day was near, and that he was very likely to die. And yet here he was, reassuring her. She wanted to tell him about the owl and the rats, tell him that something might still be done. But she decided that she had better not. She didn't really know if they would help him. It would be better to wait until she had seen them. So instead she said, rather lamely, Timothy, don't think about it anymore. When the time comes, we'll see how you are and decide what to do. Next morning, at daybreak, she went to see the rats. She had never been in the Rosebush before, never even really close to it, and now, the nearer she got, the more nervous she became. No one had ever told her, nor, as far as she knew, told any of the other animals, to keep away from it. It was just something someone knew. The rats on Mr. Fitzgibbon's farm kept to themselves. One did not prowl in their domain. She had, before coming out of the garden, looked around carefully to be sure Dragon was nowhere in sight. But even Dragon, though he would chase a rat up to the edge of the bush, would not follow him into it. Thorns, of course, helped to discourage trespassers. Mrs. Frisby had never realized until that moment, standing next to it, how very big the bush was, How dense, how incredibly thorny. It was bigger than the tractor shed, and its branches were so densely intertwined that, as small as she was, Mrs. Frisby could find no easy way to crawl into it, though she walked all the way around it looking. She remembered approximately where she had seen the rats go in, and she studied that part of the bush carefully. How had they done it? And then she saw that on one branch close to the ground the thorns had been scraped off, and about half an inch of it, not just big enough for a handhold, was worn smooth. She put her hand on this and pushed timidly. The branch yielded easily, rather like a swinging door, and behind it she saw a trail, a tunnel through the bush, wide enough so that she could walk into it without touching thorns on either side. When she went forward, she released the branch, and it swung back silently into place behind her. She was inside the bush, and it was dark. She walked forward, peering into the dimness and following the small trail which wound in a curving course toward the center of the bush, its earthen floor packed firm by the pressure of small feet. Then, straight ahead of her, she saw the entrance. She had expected what? A round hole in the dirt? Most likely, but certainly nothing like what she saw. First, a sizable clearing, about 5 feet across, had been cut from the center of the bush. Branches overhead had been cleared away too, not quite to the top of the bush, but almost, so that the sunlight filtered through easily, and soft moss grew on the ground. In the middle of this bright green cave rose a small mound, 8 inches tall, in the end of which was an arched entrance, neatly lined with stone, like a small doorway without any door. Behind the entrance, a tunnel, its floor also lined with stones, led backward and downward. Beside the entranceway, looking at her with dark, unblinking eyes, stood the biggest rat that Mrs. Frisby had ever seen. And that is the end of that chapter. Come back tomorrow at 1:30. We'll read the next 2 chapters of Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nimh. I hope you enjoyed this reading. I hope you've been enjoying the story thus far, and I hope you get out and enjoy some of the day before the rain comes tonight. Till tomorrow, stay safe, stay healthy. I'll talk to you then.